Hello everybody, welcome back to Cammie's book reading. Today we're starting with Bangalee by Stephen Cosgrove. In a very dusty corner of a very confused land stood a jumbled up pile of rocks and rubble called Kidder Castle. All around the castle was litter of all sorts. There were tires and cans, bottles and bells, and all sorts of ugly, dirty garbage. Inside this castle of rust and ruin lived some furry little creatures called critters. A critter was like no other animal you have ever seen. It had a short furry body and a fat furry face that was always dirty. For you see, the only thing critters could do well was to be messy. They never combed their hair, never washed their faces, and you would always find their clothes in the strangest of places. Day in and day out, they would dash about the castle, littering here and littering there. They would drop their candy wrappers, gum wrappers, newspapers, anywhere they happened to be. Because of all the junk lying around, never a day would go by without one of the critters slipping or tripping on a pile of garbage. Fortunately, they would usually end up falling on a pile of discarded rags, and luckily never hurt themselves. In the middle of this castle of confusion, there was one room that was absolutely sparkling clean. It was here that the cleanest of all the critters lived, and he was called Bangalee. He was short and furry just like all the other critters, except that his face was always clean. His hair was always combed, and you would never find him wearing dirty clothes. Bangalee would constantly zip about his room, picking up his toys, putting away his clothes, and dusting every nook and cranny. He would wash the windows, wash the walls, and sometimes even vacuum the halls. Bangalee was so clean and organized that he was the one creature in the whole world who could always find that spot you always miss. All the other critters would just laugh and call Bangalee names, because no matter where he went, he would polish the lamps, clean the chairs, wipe the windows, and wash the stairs. But no sooner would he finish his chores than a whole mess of critters would walk by, kicking up dust and dirt, and poor Bangalee would have to start all over again. He became so frustrated that one day he stood in the middle of the castle square and called for all the critters to gather around. "My fellow critters," he began when they had arrived, "wouldn't it be nice to live in a neat and clean castle?" "Ah, pooh," one of them muttered. "A little litter never hurt anyone." With that, the motley group went on its way, mumbling and grumbling, leaving Bangalee a bigger mess than when he had started. Things would have gone on this way forever had it not been for the Grunk. The Grunk was a monstrous, garbage-eating beast who had been wandering around the countryside for many years looking for something to eat. Since Critter Castle was the junkiest place around, it was only natural that he would come here for the super big feast. When the critters caught sight of the Grunk, they ran inside the castle and quickly tried to raise the drawbridge. There was so much garbage in the way, they could only get it closed halfway. Fortunately, there was so much litter outside that the Grunk began to eat it first. He ate some tires that had sat there so long, and he even ate a bell that had lost its gong. "Oh, what are we to do?" they cried. "The Grunk eats junk, and we're so dirty that he'll probably eat us too." They began running here and there, looking for some place to hide. But no matter where they looked, there was garbage and litter and no safe place to hide. Finally, Bangalee came forward and said, "I think I have a plan that will save us from the Grunk." With muddy tears streaming from their eyes, the critters all gathered around. "The only thing the Grunk wants is junk. If we clean up our rooms and clean up the streets and throw all the garbage outside for the Grunk to eat, then he will have no reason to come inside the castle, and we will be safe." The critters agreed and set out to clean the castle. They picked up the paper, the bottles, the cans that were lying on the ground, and then they washed the walls that were dirty and hung up their clothes and then washed off the street by using a hose. Load after load of garbage was thrown out of the castle to the waiting Grunk. Finally, there wasn't a speck of garbage or litter left in the rooms or in the square. For the first time in many, many years, the castle was clean. That Grunk had never seen so much junk. He ate the dirt, the rags, the newspapers, all, and he even ate the old rubber ball. When he had eaten all there was to eat, he sniffed and sniffed, but there just wasn't any more. With a belch and a burp, he lumbered away from the castle in search of more garbage and junk. The critters all shouted and cheered as the Grunk disappeared. Then they stopped and looked around. The castle, which had been so junky and messy, was now so clean that it sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. "If the castle can look so good after being cleaned up, maybe if you all took a bath you could feel just as good," suggested Bangalee. The critters looked at each other covered with dust and grime and proclaimed that from this day forth dirt would be a crime. So all the critters from the very old to the very young took a hot soapy bath and got clean to the bone. To this very day, Critter Castle is clean, and the junky old Grunk has never been seen again. So if your room is messy and cluttered with lots of junk, better clean up your room clean your room like Bangalee, 'cause here comes the Grunk. The end. Okay. Catundra by Stephen Cosgrove. In a perfect part of the forest, in a land of fur, purrs, and meows, stood an old dilapidated cabin that no one had lived in for a long, long time. The cabin was in such poor shape that none of the creatures of the forest would live there. None, that is, except for a ragtag fat cat called Catundra. She lived there because it was the only place where she could hide from the other animals who would laugh and call her names. Catundra, you see, had always been just a little bit plump. You could, in fact, call her downright fat. From dawn to dusk, whenever the other creatures of the forest would pass the old cabin, they would shout out and call her names. "Catundra is a fatty, neener, neener, neener." Or sometimes they'd jeer. "We'd better run away because fat Catundra might waddle over here and sit on us." Then, after chanting their nasty remarks, they would run into the forest amidst gales of laughter. How mean. Poor Catundra would feel so bad after their name-calling that she felt she just had to do something to forget that they had said, and so she would eat more and more. Every time she ate some more, she got just a little fatter, which made her feel worse, and so she ate some more. Every day it was the same thing over and over, until Catundra became so fat that she could barely walk at all. Then one day it happened that she could find nothing to eat. She looked in her favorite spot for catching mice, but they were all gone. She waddled over to the creek, but the fish were all gone. "Oh, what am I to do?" she cried. "I'm hungry and miserable. If I wasn't so miserable, I wouldn't be so hungry." It was then that Catundra noticed, right in front of her nose, a pile of dirt that seemed to be moving. She watched with her head cocked to one side as that lump of dirt shrugged once and sneezed twice, revealing a small, pathetic-looking mouse. The mole slowly shook the dirt from his ears, rubbed the dust from his eyes, and carefully looked around. "That's odd," he said. "The sky is clear, but I'm standing in a shadow. He turned around to see what was causing the shadow, and sure enough, there was a very hungry-looking Catundra. With an oops and a "excuse me," he made a dash back into his burrow. He had just gotten his head back into the hole when, with one slow movement of her paw, Catundra trapped that poor mole by his tail. With a tear in her eye, Catundra carefully picked up the mole and waddled back to the cabin to enjoy her melancholy meal. "Are you going to eat me?" asked the mole. "Yes," sobbed Catundra. The mole thought for a moment and then asked, "Why me? I'm barely a mouthful. My fur is all full of rocks, and I probably taste like dirt. Surely there is something you would rather eat than me." "I'm going to eat you," sobbed Catundra. "Not because you are good to eat, but because there isn't anything else to eat, and I have to eat because I feel so miserable." "Now wait a minute," said the mole indignantly, as he dropped with a plop. "Why do you feel so miserable?" Catundra decided to tell him the whole story of how she had just got a little fat as a kitten and how all the other cats laughed and made fun of her. She went on telling how she had run away to this cabin, but had no sooner arrived than all the other creatures of the forest began making fun of her too. "So you see, little mole, the only thing that makes me happy is to eat." It was at that moment that the mole came up with a super plan. "Cat," he said, "you're going at this all wrong. Rather than eating, you should go on a diet and get yourself in shape. If you're not fat, then nobody can make fun of you. And if they don't make fun of you, you won't be miserable. And if you're not miserable, you won't want to eat." Catundra looked at the mole and thought. "Maybe, little mole, you are right. But you will help me, and if you are wrong, I can always eat you later." So, beginning that very day, Catundra started to exercise with the little mole. He would have her jog just a little way, then stop and let her rest. Then, when she had caught her breath and rested well, he would have her run some more, always telling her how slim and beautiful she would be. Catundra had been exercising for days and days, and slowly but surely she was losing weight. Once in a while, one of the creatures of the forest would stop and tease her, but the little mole would run them off and remind Catundra that soon they would have nothing to tease her about. Once in a while, Catundra would get that hungry look in her eye, but the little mole would wisely tell her to eat some more fresh veggies. Once he even let her catch a small minnow from the stream just to keep her strength. By now, Catundra had lost so much weight that the little mole had to hang on to her neck furiously as she raced about the cabin. She would run up a tree just as high and as fast as she could, and then turn and dash merrily down again. She could jump higher than she had ever been able to jump before, and the most surprising thing was that she wasn't sad or melancholy anymore. Most importantly, the other creatures of the forest didn't call her names because she had slimmed down to the prettiest cat they had ever seen. And it came to be that on any beautiful summer morning, you could find Catundra basking in the sunshine with the little mole fast asleep, leaning on her knee. The end. Moonday by Adam Rex. That's very pretty. The moon hung full and low and touched the tips of the trees. We whispered words like big and beautiful. Through the backseat window, I followed its flight. Past the dark, sleeping park and the bright, empty streets. Then I drifted to sleep and was lifted to bed. The next morning, the moon was lower and larger and very nearly on the ground. It was in our backyard. I asked, "Why is it so large and low? Why is it in our backyard?" "Huh," Dad said and rubbed his chin. "Pick me up," I said. From Dad's shoulders, I brushed the moon with my fingertips. It was chalky and cold. I climbed into a crater. "I'm going to have a look around." Mom said, "Okay, zip up your coat." I walked over and under and around to where Mom and Dad waited. "What now?" Nothing had missed us. Morning had missed us. In darkness, the town awoke and went to work. At school, we slumped in desks and slept through lunch. I looked through my heavy lashes, through the window, through lean trees to see my blue moon staring back at me. In science, Ms. Ellen wrote, "The moon has gravity and that makes the tides turn." In English, she wrote, "Moon is a noun and sometimes a verb." In math, she wrote, 1 + 1 = moon. Then she blinked and stepped back from the board. "That's not right," she said. "I'm sleepy. Class is dismissed." As I walked and I watched the weary townfolk. Hushed, they shuffled through slush and dozed off at stoplights. The band on Bleecker Street could only sigh into the microphone. "Lullaboo, I love you. Shashalula, lullaboo." Then I started to yawn. That swayed up the block, crossed 2 policemen, rounded the square, and followed me home. In my backyard, Mom and Dad tried to hide the moon under blankets and tablecloths. "Hot air balloon," yawned our neighbor as he leaned over the fence. "Yes, I guess," my mom said. "It's the latest fad," said Dad. That was when the tide came in. It trickled into our backyard. The tide came in, smooth and thin, and settled underneath our moon. Big, I said, and beautiful. Wet, said Dad. It doesn't belong in our backyard, said Mom, and I could do without the dogs. I said, maybe we should take it for a drive. So we drove with the moon in our window that night, through the bright empty streets, past the dark sleeping park. It followed our flight to the top of the hill, where it lit on the tips of the trees. Then I told the moon stay. As we rumbled away. And it stayed in the night at the top of the hill and looked smaller and higher the lower we drove. There it goes, I said. There goes the moon, said Dad. There goes our good tablecloth, said Mom. In the purring car, I fell asleep. Dad carried me to bed and said good night. In other towns and neighbors' beds, they said good night, turned off the light, and it was a good night everywhere. The end. The Berenstain Bears and the Blame Game by Stan and Jan Berenstain. You all know the bear family that lives in the big tree house down a sunny dirt road deep in bear country. And, of course, you know Mama Bear, warm, friendly Mama Bear, for whom seldom is heard a discouraging word. But lately Mama hadn't been all that friendly. Her smile was gone and she was feeling very discouraged. Why? Because life in the big tree house had turned into one long, miserable, never-ending blame game. Cries of, he started it, no, she started it, and it was her fault. No, it was his fault, filled the air from day to night. Life in the big tree house had started... Life in the big tree house had become one long argument about who started it and whose fault it was, and Mama had had quite enough of it. So when she heard the sounds of breaking glass and spilling water, she rushed into the living room. There she found a mess of broken glass, spilled water, and a scatter of roses on the floor. Standing over the mess were Brother and Sister Bear. They were pointing at each other and shouting, "It was her fault. No, it was his fault," over and over again. Mama had looked at the mess. She had cut those roses and put them in the vase with water just that morning. She looked at Brother and Sister, who were still pointing and shouting at each other. It was time to put a stop to the blame game. Mama decided to put her foot down hard. So hard that it shook the room. "Enough of this blame game," she shouted. "I want to know who really started it, and I want to know right now." Well, it was like peeling back the layers of an onion. It was enough to make you cry. Mama might have if she hadn't been so angry, and the more Brother and Sister pointed and shouted, the angrier Mama got. "He knocked it over," cried Sister. "He made the mess." "But that was only because she was trying to poke me in the ribs," shouted Brother. I was not trying to poke him, protested Sister. I was just trying to tickle him because he tickled me this morning. But that was because she tickled me last night. But that was because he put a rubber snake on my bed. But that was because she put a squeaky toy on my chair and it squeaked when I sat down. And so it went. But, because, Mama understood that she wasn't getting to the bottom of anything, but she was getting to the end of her patience. Her head was a whirl with buts, becauses, rubber snakes, squeaky toys, broken glass, water spilled, and scattered roses. Enough! She shouted. Enough of what? Asked Papa Bear. He had been fixing up the downstairs bay window and heard the shouting. From what I've heard, he said, looking at the mess on the floor, there's more than enough blame to go around, so instead of playing the blame game, why don't we just go to work and solve the problem? Let's deal with the broken glass for starters. Brother, you fetch the dustpan and broom. Sister, you bring the paper towels from the kitchen. Papa quickly swept the bigger pieces of broken glass into the dustpan. What about the water and the roses and the little pieces of broken glass? Asked Sister. Mama, said Papa, will you please pick up the roses, but look out for thorns and broken glass? Then he laid paper towels on the whole wet mess. He swept what was left into the dustpan. Mama put the roses into another vase. But while Papa was putting away his paint and putty, he heard the sound of breaking glass. Good for Papa. He had put a stop to the blame game. Papa went back to his workshop. Good for Papa. He had put a stop to the blame game. Papa went back to his workshop. The cubs went out to play. But while Papa was putting away his paint and putty, he heard the sound of breaking glass. He rushed outside. The bay window he had just painted, and brother and sister pointed at each other. Sister had a bat, brother had a glove. There was a baseball in the grass among pieces of broken glass. Papa bit his lip, counted to 10, took a deep breath, and did a very good imitation of a volcano. It was his fault. He's the one who wanted to play ball. He's the one who threw it. His fault. It was her fault. She's the one who hit it. Her fault. It seems to me, said Mama, who had heard the crash, that instead of shouting and pointing fingers, we should get to work and solve the problem. And that's what they did. They picked up the glass and went to work. It took some doing, but after a little while the window was painted and puttied as good as new. Of course, there are times, said Papa, when someone really is to blame for something, but most of the time it's important to remember there's usually enough blame to go around. The end. Curious George by Margaret and H.A. Ray. Curious George takes a train. This is George. He is a good little monkey and always very curious. This morning George and the man with the yellow hat were at the train station. They were taking a trip to the country with their friend, Mrs. Nettleman. But first they had to get tickets. Inside the train station, everyone was in a hurry. People rushed to buy newspapers to read and treats to eat. Then they rushed to catch their trains. But one little boy with a brand new toy engine was not in a hurry, nor was the small crowd next to him. They were just standing in one spot looking up. George looked up too. Train master was moving numbers and letters on a big sign. Soon the train master was called away, but his job did not look too finished. George was curious. Could he help? George climbed up in a flash. Then, just like the train master, he picked up a letter off the sign and put it in a different place. Next, he took the number 9 and put it near a 2. George moved more letters and more numbers. He was glad to be such a big help. "Hey," yelled a man from below, "I can't tell when my train leaves." "What track is my train on?" said another man. "What's that monkey doing up there?" demanded a woman. She did not sound happy. The train master did not sound happy either. "Come down from there right now," he hollered at George. Poor George. It's too easy for a monkey to get into trouble, but lucky for George, it's also easy for a monkey to get out of trouble. Right then, the conductor shouted, "All aboard!" A crowd of people rushed toward the train. George simply slid down a pole, scurried over a suitcase, and squeezed with the crowd through the gate. Then he found the perfect hiding spot for a monkey. The little boy with the toy engine also ran through the gate. "Look, Daddy," he said, "a train." His father looked up. "Come back, son," he yelled. "That's not our train." But it was too late. The gate locked behind him. The boy began to cry. George peeked out of his hiding place. He saw the boy's toy roll toward the tracks. The boy ran after it. This time George knew he could help. He leaped out of his hiding place and ran fast. George grabbed the toy engine before the boy came too close to the tracks. What a close call. When the trainmaster opened the gate, the boy's father ran to his son. The boy was not crying now. He was playing with his new friend. "So there you are," said the trainmaster when he saw George. "You made a lot of trouble on the big board." "Please, don't be upset with him," said the boy's father. "He saved my son." People on the platform agreed. They had seen what had happened, and they clapped and cheered. George was a hero. Just then the man with the yellow hat arrived with Mrs. Nettleman. "It's time to go, George," he said. "Here comes our train." "This is our train too," the father said. The little boy was excited. "Can George ride with us?" he asked. That sounded like a good idea to everyone, so the trainmaster asked the conductor to find them a special seat. And he did, right up front. The end. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in for another book reading. I'm here every Thursday. Bye!